The wind pressed itself against the walls of the small frontier cabin, humming low like a restless spirit searching for a crack in the timber. Inside, lantern light trembled across rough-hewn beams, casting long shadows that swayed as if breathing. Elias Ward sat alone at his wooden table, elbows planted, hands clasped loosely, staring at the untouched bowl of stew before him. The chair opposite him sat empty. The cushion still held the faint imprint of someone small and slender, someone who used to hum while she ate, someone whose laughter once softened the sharpness of winter. Someone gone. Elias's jaw flexed as he tried again not to look at the rocking chair in the corner, the one his wife Clara had used every night to calm their son. His son who had followed her into the grave 2 winters ago. Outside, snow beat softly against the window, each flake tapping like a memory trying to get back in. He closed his eyes. Didn't help. The memories came anyway. Clara kneeling by the hearth, hair glowing in firelight. Clara smiling with her whole face. Clara holding their newborn, breath ragged, whispering, "Promise me. Don't let the world harden you." He had promised. He had broken it. The world had hardened him until his heart felt like ice trapped beneath frozen soil. He exhaled slow. Then, a faint thud, a scraping sound. Elias's head snapped up. He pushed back his chair and stood, instinct tightening through him like a drawn bow. This land didn't forgive carelessness. People didn't travel at night unless they had reason or desperation. He crossed to the window. The glass was fogged from the warmth inside, so he wiped a clear circle with the edge of his sleeve. A dark figure staggered through the storm, half collapsing with each step. Another smaller shape clung behind, holding onto the first as though the wind might steal them away. Elias's breath hitched. Woman. Child? His hand rose to the rifle mounted above the door. Habit, not hostility. He didn't know who they were, didn't know what they wanted. But he knew one thing for certain. If they kept walking, they'd freeze before moonrise. His chest twisted. Not again. Not another grave in the snow. He lowered the rifle. 3 heavy knocks shook the door. Elias hesitated for only a breath before opening it. Cold crashed into the cabin like a wave. A woman stood there. Early 30s, face wind-burned, coat torn at the shoulder, snow crusted in her dark hair. A girl clung to her skirts, maybe 8 years old, eyes wide and hollow with fear. Evening, the woman said, voice raw but steady. Our wagon overturned in the ravine. My daughter's near frozen. We need shelter. Just till dawn. Her voice did not plead. It stated truth. A frontier rule. You help, or someone dies. Elias stepped aside. Come in, he said quietly. The woman nodded, ushering her daughter inside. The child stumbled, blue-lipped, trembling. Elias kicked the door shut, sealing out the storm. The woman crouched next to the girl, rubbing her arms, blowing warm breaths over her fingers. What's her name? Elias asked. Lydia. And yours? Margaret Hale. She removed her gloves, revealing reddened hands that looked blistered from cold. I can get the fire going hotter, Elias murmured, already moving toward the hearth. He stoked the flames, adding logs until the fire roared bright. Warmth blossomed across the room, chasing shadows. Lydia curled closer to the heat, eyes fluttering shut. Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief. Elias stepped back, studying them quietly. Mother and daughter, exhausted, frozen, lucky to be alive. Something deep within him, something he had sealed away, shifted. You'll stay the night, he said. Margaret opened her mouth as if to protest, but he cut her off gently. Storm's getting worse. Dawn won't be kind. Margaret swallowed and nodded. Elias set a tin bowl in front of her, then one before Lydia. Margaret watched him carefully, reading the grief etched into his features the way only someone with their own grief could see. You live alone? She asked softly. 2 winters now, Elias replied. He didn't add why. Didn't need to. Margaret's gaze flicked to the rocking chair. Her expression softened with quiet understanding. Lydia lifted her eyes. Sir, is this your home? Was my family's, Elias said. Still is, I reckon. The girl gave a small, shy smile. It feels warm. He froze at the words. Warm. No one had said that in years. Margaret touched her daughter's shoulder gently. Eat slow, she murmured. Then she looked at Elias. Thank you, truly. He nodded once, unable to trust his voice. They ate in silence, but not the empty kind he had lived with. It was a human silence, the kind shared by people surviving the same cold world. When the bowls were empty, Elias rose and pulled extra blankets from the cedar chest. "You two take the bed," he said simply. Margaret stiffened. "We can sleep by the fire. You don't need to—" "It's warmer in the room," he insisted. "Take it." Their eyes held for a moment, hers full of gratitude she didn't want to expose, his roughened by loneliness he didn't want acknowledged. He gestured toward the bedroom. Margaret helped Lydia to her feet. At the doorway she hesitated, glancing again at the rocking chair. "You loved her," she said softly. Elias didn't respond, didn't need to. Margaret offered a gentle nod before guiding Lydia into the room. Elias sat alone again, staring at the chair. But the silence felt different. Less like a tomb, more like a pause. He stared into the fire. A woman and a child slept beneath his roof. Strangers, yet somehow not strangers at all. And for the first time in 2 years, he didn't dread the morning. He feared it. Because morning meant they might leave. And something inside him, the part that still remembered warmth, whispered that he didn't want them to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The morning arrived like a hush. Thin light slipping under shutters, silver and careful. Elias woke to the smell of coffee before sound reached him. Margaret humming low to herself as she stirred a pot on the iron stove. The melody was small and steady, like a hand finding its way over a wounded heart. He dressed quietly, the boards creaking soft beneath his boots. For a moment he watched her from the doorway, the way her fingers worked the ladle, how she bent to check on Lydia's breathing. There was a steadiness in her that was not showy. It was the kind of courage that had the look of ordinary things done again and again. When she saw him, she offered a smile that trembled, then steadied. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he answered. The word rough as gravel but warm inside. They ate together, 4 chairs filled. For the first time in 2 winters and the cabin's edges seemed to expand, as if the walls were learning to hold more than grief. Lydia, rubbing her eyes, watched Elias with a sudden shy curiosity. "Did you fix the wheel?" she asked, as if that was the simplest thing a man could be proud of. Elias glanced out the window where the wagon slumped against a low bank, the repaired wheel propped and mended. He told the children the simple truth about the work, and Margaret watched him with something like approval, though she kept her gaze careful, like a woman who had learned the hard economy of hope. After breakfast they stepped outside. The morning was bright and cold. The sun cut the snow into diamonds. Lydia and Willa, that was the name of Elias's daughter, ran at once to one another, 2 small explosions of laughter and shouts that filled the air, unafraid of the line between strangers and siblings. Margaret lingered at the barn, checking harnesses, talking to the horse in the kind of voice that made the animal lower its head. Elias watched her hands move and thought of how clean a person's life looked when someone mended what was broken and tied things right again. There were words between them, soft, not yet naming themselves. Margaret told him they had been headed to the nearest township to seek work. Her brother had offered a place, but the road had turned traitor. Elias said nothing of the days he had spent closing the world down, of the long nights he had traded for the kind of strict, private grief that carves hollows where laughter used to live. He spoke instead of fixing, of tools, of wood not yet season-cured, of plans. They argued logistics, where to set the girls' beds, who would watch the animals, how to stretch provisions, until their conversation turned into a sort of domestic treaty. Small commitments that meant staying rather than passing through. It was the exchange of hesitant promises, the stitching of a new pattern from damaged cloth. By noon they had agreed. Margaret would stay until she could travel safely, but if she liked the valley, if the work in the township were scarce, she might linger longer. She offered to barter her seam work. She could mend clothes and tailor coats, she said. Elias hesitated at the word longer, a small iron taste in his mouth. He listened as her voice described how she had learned to stitch, with nimble efficiency, how a piece of clothing could be made whole and quietly useful again. Willa hovered at his elbow the whole time, eyes bright with the novelty of building, forts with Lydia and teaching her the names of birds in the trees. Watching them together, Elias felt something inside him. Guarded. Small, easing its defense just a little. That night, as twilight sank and the cabin lamp guttered gold against deepening indigo, Margaret sat near the hearth while Elias worked at his bench. He carved a small horse for Lydia, slow attentive strokes bringing wood alive. The room hummed with household sounds. The click of needles, the rasp of the whittling knife, Lydia's quiet humming as she tried to braid a scrap of ribbon. There was no grand declaration. There were simply these ordinary acts that had always made houses into homes. At some point, Margaret's voice dropped, and the air thickened, with the kind of admission that is not dramatic but necessary. "We left because staying was killing us," she said softly. "My husband, he got sick in Kansas. Fever took him in 3 days. I promised I'd go somewhere his memory couldn't find me in every field and pew. So I walked." Her eyes were steady and tired. Elias listened, feeling a map of recognition unfold in his chest. He had said similar things aloud at the grave. That he would not let memory drown him. That he would keep breathing beyond it. But he had not known how, until he saw Clara's chair catching the lamplight in a way that made it feel not like an accusation but like an offering. "What makes you think you can start again?" he asked quietly, almost embarrassed by the directness. Margaret looked at him and shrugged, half a smile creeping under the exhaustion. "Because I have to," she said simply. "Because Lydia needs something more than a road. Because mornings like this are too rare to let pass." He felt the truth of that in his bones. There were mornings you let pass, and there were mornings you held on to like a lantern. The girls, Lydia and Willa, became the lanterns. Days passed slow and folded together, clearing snow, patching roofs, mending a torn coat, making bread, teaching Lydia to whittle a safe edge on a stick. There were moments when silence returned heavy as a blanket, and Elias would step outside by himself to a world sharpened to bone. In those hours he would pace the fence line and speak to the wind, saying things to Clara as if the mountains could carry his confessions and return forgiveness. Margaret did not press him. Instead, she left small offerings, freshly mended socks, a mug of warmed spiced milk left on the table without comment. She would sit across from him and listen when his voice broke on a sentence. When it did, she did not flinch. She folded his words up and set them beside her heart like fragile things to keep safe. One evening, after a day of unrelenting wind, a neighbor named Jonah came by with news and a cautious manner. The community in the valley was sparse. Split families, men who hunted, women who bartered, but they had eyes and tongues. And Jonah's visit was both rumor and welcome. "You got yourself company." He grinned without malice. "Mrs. Hale and her girl. Storms turned ugly, so they're stuck." He paused, looking at Elias and then at the two women. "Good for you, Ward. The place needed a woman's hands." Elias bristled against the compliment like a man unused to being noticed. Yet Jonah remained, talking steady about the market, about where to find patch leather and nails. His presence anchored the valley in a way that felt like validation. It is small things. Neighbors, a shared well, a bartered sack of grain that knit a life into something believable. That night, after Jonah left and the girls were asleep curled in the loft like two small moons against the dark, Elias and Margaret stood by the window. Outside, the world was a folded sheet of white. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and yeast. "I'm scared," Elias said, quieted by the intimacy of admission. Margaret met him with the calm of someone who had worn fear as a constant companion. "We all are," she said, "but that's not a reason to stop." He turned to her, surprised. She was not the kind to make promises she couldn't keep. "What if I push you away?" he asked. The question was honest and raw. She took her time answering. "Then you'll have to apologize and learn to be better," she said. And the answer, a half-joke, half-agreement, was the thing that broke the last brittle shell in him. It was human and imperfect and possible. "We can be patient," she added. "Lydia and Willa can teach us." He laughed then, a small calloused sound that startled both of them. It was the first laugh he'd allowed himself in a long while, and it felt like the beginning of something solid rather than an illusion. They walked outside together into the deep hush of the valley. The stars were thick, and Elias felt his heart beat in his throat like a trapped bird. He wanted to say more. He wanted to vow and promise and swear. But the night taught him to be wise. Words can freeze in mouths as frost forms on glass. Instead, he lifted Margaret's hand and held it for a long while. No declarations, no fireworks, only the warmth of skin against skin and the knowledge that someone else had chosen to stay, even for a little while. When they returned, they found the loft empty. Lydia and Willa had come down silently, their expressions solemn. "Papa?" Willa said in a voice that made Elias realize the girls understood much more than adults credited them. "Will Miss Margaret stay?" Elias looked at Margaret. She smiled and knelt to Willa's height. "I think she likes it here," Lydia said suddenly, proud of herself for knowing something true. "I want her to stay too." Elias felt something in his chest shift, soft and enormous, not forgetting, but adding. He could hold Clara's memory and still make space for a new warmth to grow. It would not be simple. The seasons would test them. Old grief would come like winter storms. But perhaps, he thought, just perhaps, they could weather it together. Outside, snow began to fall. Not the violent kind that had brought them here, but a gentle, forgiving drift that coated the world like a blessing. The cabin glowed with lamplight and steady laughter, small, imperfect, and warm. In the morning, they would decide on work and schooling and whether Margaret truly would stay. But for now they sat together, the four of them in a circle, hands sometimes touching, breathing the same air that tasted faintly of cinnamon. And the house, no longer an instrument of memory alone, became a careful, living thing, a place where the past could be honored without living in its shadow, where new promises were whispered like prayers, and where the slow work of love began in the ordinary acts of making bread, mending clothes, and fixing what life broke. They slept like that, tentative, joined. Dawn would bring decisions, and the valley would watch and offer its small mercies. But in the hush before morning, Elias understood something he had not been ready to feel before, that holding on too tight to what was lost could be its own theft, and that to keep Clara's memory alive he did not need to imprison himself in grief. He only needed to live. Winter stretched itself over the valley like a great white beast settling in for a long sleep. Weeks passed, each one folding quietly into the next. Margaret and Lydia remained, not because the wagon wheel couldn't bear the road, but because the house had turned into something gentler than the lives they'd fled. Elias didn't say she should stay. Margaret didn't ask permission. They both simply began living as though the question had already been answered. Every morning the cabin breathed with new routine. Bread rising in the corner, boots drying by the fire, children laughing as they tried to braid each other's hair. The air no longer felt thin and cold. It pulsed with life, even in silence. And silence came often. Sometimes Elias would step outside before sunrise, boots sinking into packed snow, breath clouding. He walked the fence line with his head down, whispering things to the mountains that he could not yet say to Margaret. On those mornings, she pretended not to see the way his shoulders hunched, the way he clutched the locket beneath his shirt like a man asking for strength. Other mornings, it was Margaret who drifted toward the barn, smoothing her fingers over rough wood, blinking away sudden tears. A memory, a ghost, a whisper. Something always pulled at her. Lydia would sometimes run after her, calling, "Mama?" And she'd wipe her eyes quickly before turning with a smile. Neither adult asked the other what shadows tugged at their steps. Not yet. There are some questions that need a safe place to land. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the world glowed gold, Margaret found Elias splitting logs. His coat was off, sleeves rolled, steam rising from his breath and skin. He swung the axe like every strike was a confession he could not voice. She stood watching him for a moment, arms folded, scarf flapping in the wind. "You're working too hard," she said finally. "Work keeps the mind quiet." "That's not the same as peaceful." He paused mid-swing. The axe hovered above the block. "And what would you know about my peace?" Margaret didn't answer at first. She walked toward him slowly, each step crunching in the snow. When she reached him, she set a gloved hand gently atop his wrist, urging the blade down. "I don't need to know your peace," she said softly. "I can see your bruises." He swallowed hard. The world felt suddenly too close. "I'm trying, Margaret," he said. He hated how brittle his voice sounded. I know, she replied. And you don't have to swing through your grief to prove it. Lydia and Willa burst from the cabin then, shaking snow from their mittens, shouting about a fort they were building near the oak tree. Tiny ambassadors of joy, yanking the world back into place. Margaret stepped back, letting Elias breathe. He forced a smile. Go help them, she said, nudging him. They'll think the fort belongs to wolves if you don't. He snorted. Wolves wouldn't build it so crooked. Oh? And would you build it straighter? I'd try. Trying is all any of us are doing. Their eyes held for a moment too long, a moment too honest. Then Lydia tugged Margaret's hand, and the spell broke. Later, as dusk seeped through the valley and supper cooked slow on the stove, the girls worked on a puzzle Jonah had brought, pieces cut from old wood, forming a map of the land. Margaret hummed while sewing Willa's torn dress. Lydia leaned against her mother. Willa leaned against Elias's knee, a picture of domesticity, quiet and unremarkable. But it struck Elias so suddenly that it hurt. He bit the inside of his cheek, looked away. Margaret noticed. When the children went to bed, she approached him by the fire. The flames painted gold across her face, lighting the strands of her hair like threads of copper. Elias, she said gently, I know you hold back. I know why. But you don't have to protect me from your past. He stared into the fire. You don't know what you're asking. Yes, she said, I do. No, he whispered. You don't. Silence stretched, long and thin. She sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. Tell me about her. He stiffened. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind shifted. Margaret didn't press. She just waited, the way one waits for a wild creature to come close. After several breaths, his voice finally emerged. Clara, he began, throat tight. She had a way of making every room brighter. She'd laugh when she was afraid so no one else would be. She planted wildflowers everywhere, even knowing winter would kill them. Said it was worth it for the blooming. Margaret's eyes softened. And your son? She asked quietly. Elias blinked hard. His name was Samuel. He didn't stay long. Margaret placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. I'm sorry, she whispered. It's my fault, he choked out. She turned sharply. Don't say that. I couldn't save them. You held them. You buried them. You kept going. That is saving what you could. His breath quivered, then broke. Margaret's fingers slid between his. Elias, grief doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. He closed his eyes. And what does loving you make me? He asked, voice barely audible, breaking open like thawing ice. Margaret froze. The fire snapped loudly between them. I don't know, she whispered honestly. But you're not doing it alone. He let out a broken, breathless sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Before she could pull away, Elias leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers. A quiet, trembling touch. Not a kiss. Not yet. Something more fragile. Just two wounded hearts trying to remember how to beat. Margaret held still, breath warm against his cheek. We'll go slow, she murmured. I'm not sure I know how. I'll teach you. He exhaled shakily. And if I falter? Then you lean, she said, and I'll hold. Their hands remained intertwined long after the fire dimmed, long after the night deepened. The cabin was silent but not empty. Up in the loft, the girls slept peacefully. Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, something thawed slowly, painfully, beautifully. Not hope, not yet, but the first step toward it. Winter deepened, settling into the valley with a heaviness that felt almost watchful. The days grew shorter, the nights sharper. But inside the cabin, something warm had begun to bloom, slow as sap rising in frozen trees. Elias found himself laughing more. Margaret found herself humming more. The girls, two small suns, orbited every corner of the house, pulling light into places that had once been shadows. And then one morning, everything changed. Jonah arrived breathless on horseback, snow whipping from his coat. There's trouble in town, he said. A traveling trader claims he knows Margaret, says she fled with debt on her back. The world tilted. Margaret froze where she stood, the color draining from her face. Lydia clung to her skirt immediately, sensing danger the way children do, without needing explanation. Elias's gut nodded. Is it true? Margaret lifted her chin. I didn't flee debt. I fled a man who wanted ownership over us after my husband died. He said he'd take us off compassion if I couldn't pay back the cost of the funeral. Jonah's face darkened. This traitor wants reward money. Says he's tracking women who escaped responsibilities. He's spreading word you're hiding. Elias felt something hot and ancient flare in his chest. A protective rage. Margaret stood quietly, hands trembling, but her voice steady. I did not run from my responsibilities, Elias. I ran from cruelty. He stepped closer. You don't owe me an explanation. But I owe myself one, she whispered. I won't live hiding. Not again. If this man comes, he won't reach you, Elias said, sharper than he intended. Margaret looked up at him, surprise softening her fear. Jonah cleared his throat. He's lodging at the tavern. Might come up the valley tomorrow. The moment Jonah left, Margaret sagged against the table. The girls watched wide-eyed. Elias touched her arm gently. What do you want to do? She swallowed. I want to stop running. And you will, he said. But you won't do it alone. That night, no one slept well. Margaret tossed in her cot. Elias paced the room so many times the floorboards learned his steps. Snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a quiet that felt too tense. When dawn broke, pale and muted, they heard it. A wagon, hooves crunching through frost. Margaret stiffened. Elias reached for his coat and stepped outside before she could protest. The trader, a thick-set man with a fur collar and a self-important scowl, rode into the clearing. You hiding a widow here? He called out. Her name's Margaret Hale. She's got dues unpaid. Elias didn't flinch. You're mistaken. I've got posters. I've got rights. She belongs with me. The words belonged like a chain snapping tight. Elias stepped forward. No woman belongs to you. The trader sneered. You planning to fight a lawful claim, Ward? You planning to let a thief and a liar corrupt your place? Before Elias could answer, the cabin door opened. Margaret stepped out, her coat wrapped tight, her hair braided back, her fear tucked under a layer of fierce resolve. Lydia peeked out behind her mother's legs. Elias's heart twisted at the sight. I owe you nothing, Margaret said evenly. My husband died. You offered help at a cost that no decent man would demand. You think you can just run? The trader snapped. You and that brat? Lydia whimpered. Margaret moved in front of her. Elias's voice dropped low, dangerous. Don't speak about the child. The trader spat on the ground. Law's on my side. No, Elias said. Not here. This valley is under county protection, and no law in this land forces a woman to trade herself for debt. Margaret blinked. She hadn't known that. The trader faltered. Elias stepped closer, shoulders squared, voice steady as steel. Get off my land. You can't. You're leaving, Elias said coldly. Now. The trader looked between them, calculating the fight in Elias's eyes, the rifle by the door, the neighbors down the valley who would come running at a single whistle. He spat again, climbed onto his wagon and turned the horse with a jerk. This isn't over, he growled. It is, Elias said. He watched until the man disappeared into the trees. When Elias turned back to Margaret, she was trembling, not with fear, with relief breaking loose. She stepped toward him. Why did you? Because you deserve safety, he said softly. And choice. You choose where you go, who you trust, who you build a life with. Her breath hitched. And if I choose here? Elias swallowed. Then I thank God for the mercy. The girls rushed out then. Willa hugging Margaret, Lydia hugging Elias, the four forming a circle that felt like the closing of a wound and the opening of a future. Later that evening, when the children were asleep in the loft, Margaret and Elias stood by the fire, warm glow reflecting in their eyes. You saved me, she said quietly. He shook his head. No, you saved yourself. I just helped clear the way. She stepped closer. And now what do we do, Elias Ward? Two women who need a place. A man learning how to love again. Two children already acting like sisters. Elias looked at the rocking chair, Clara's chair, and didn't flinch this time. We build, he said simply. Slow, true, careful. Margaret's voice softened. And if you falter? I'll lean. And if I falter? I'll catch you. Snow whispered against the glass, gentle, forgiving. Elias reached for her hand, tentative, reverent. and she took it, fingers sliding into his as if they'd been waiting for this shape. He leaned down, forehead touching hers. "Margaret," he breathed. "Stay." Her eyes shone. "I would like to." He kissed her then, softly, carefully, like a man making a promise instead of claiming a prize. Her hands lifted to his face, not erasing the past, but honoring it. When they pulled apart, the world felt new. In the loft, a small voice whispered, "Papa? Miss Margaret?" They turned. Willa and Lydia peeked over the railing, sleepy-eyed, smiling like dawn. Elias chuckled under his breath, and Margaret laughed softly. He lifted an arm. "Come here, little ones." The girls climbed down and rushed into their arms. The four of them huddled beside the warm fire. Margaret looked up at Elias. "Is this what a family feels like?" He squeezed her hand. "It's the beginning of one." Outside, winter howled. Inside, love settled, slow, steady, certain. Not replacing what was lost, but growing beside it. A new fire in an old hearth. A home rebuilt not from forgetting, but from grace.